Hey everybody, welcome to this first lecture on rhetorical grammar. Without much further ado, let's just dive right into the material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this PowerPoint as I go along. Now the goals of these lectures are to help you comprehend the material that you'll be learning about in the rhetorical grammar textbook. These lectures are meant to be supplementary. They are not required. If you feel like you understand this material, just feel free to hop off whenever, but hopefully they are useful as you are trying to master these new concepts. Now, the place to start a study of grammar is with words and the types of words we have in English: open class and closed class. Open class words are nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives, all words that can be inflected. For instance, you can add an ending like ed to make it past tense or ing to make it into a verb form. Likewise, open words are essentially infinite. You can, and we often do, make up new ones all the time. Think of Lewis Carroll's nonsense poem, Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." Now, what's fun about the poem is how it both makes no sense at all and still kind of makes sense at the same time. That's because Carroll is creating nouns and verbs and adjectives and putting them in the places we would expect them, so it still sounds like English. But notice that not all the words are nonsense words. And the, and in, and all, because there's no way Carroll could have invented new words for those. He couldn't say "'twas brillig, bunjo crine, and slithy toves." That wouldn't make any sense at all. That's because and the, and in are the other type of words, closed class words. Closed class words include articles and pronouns like the, a, he, those, which help indicate which or what type of noun we are referring to, and prepositions like in and of, which we'll talk about later. They are closed because you can't invent new words like these willy-nilly like you can with nouns and verbs, and you also can't inflect them. You can't say thud or thosing and make any sense. So let's go back to open class words. The next thing we need to learn to really advance our study of grammar is that what our high school English teachers they got wrong about grammar. So let's talk about some basic definition of these words. You probably remember learning at some point that a noun is a person, place, or thing, and a verb is the action that the noun does. Now that might work in some cases, but it is limited. So take the sentence, "Running is my favorite sport." Both running and sport are nouns, but are they what we'd usually think of when we think of persons, places, or things? And does the word "is" really fit the definition of an action that the noun does? So we need to think more broadly about what nouns and verbs are. Rather than thinking in terms of words, we should think in terms of words and phrases, which is just a group of words. So what counts as a noun in a sentence could be a single word, like book, or it could be a whole group of words, like the book my grandmother gave me. We call these noun phrases, or we might also call them nominals. They're words or groups of words that perform a noun function in a sentence. Likewise, verbs can be a single word like rest, or it could be a group of words like has been resting. So probably the most reliable definition of a single word, a single noun word is a word that can be made plural and or possessive, and a verb is best defined as a word that can show tense, both as past and or present. So a couple of other key words to learn. Head word refers to the primary noun or verb in a noun or verb phrase. Everything else that's not the head word would be the modifiers. Determiner refers to words like the, a, or all that signal which or what type of noun we're talking about. So thus, a noun phrase is the noun head word with all its pre- and post-noun modifiers, and a verb phrase is a verb together with all its complements and modifiers. And all that definition will make sense as we go along. Okay, so your homework is asking you to do the odd questions for each of the exercises. So we're gonna look at the even ones together. Now remember that you can look at the back of the book to check your answers for the odd ones, and we'll just talk through the even ones so that those make sense since you can't check those yourself. So let's look at number 2. CGI helped produce the lush cinematic rainforest of James Cameron's Avatar as well as the teeming orc armies of Peter Jackson's Hobbit series. Excuse me, let me start with the instructions. Identify the determiners and head words of the noun phrases in the following sentence. So we're looking for determiners and then the noun phrases and their head words. If a noun phrase does not have a determiner, how do you know it is still a noun phrase? All right, so if I'm looking for determiners first, I'm going to say that the here is a determiner. I would also say James Cameron's is a possessive that indicates to, actually, sorry, let me back up. James Cameron's is not a determiner. Let me just focus on the determiners for a second. So the, and the here, and yeah, I think that's all of them. What I was getting to is that James Cameron's is a possessive adjective. It's telling us which avatar, whose avatar, who does it belong to, much like Peter Jackson's. And that helps me know if I have a noun or a noun phrase here, because remember, a noun is something that can be possessed. It can have a possessive. So if we go to the question in the exercise, if a noun phrase does not have a determiner, how do you know it is still a noun phrase? Because you could potentially add a possessive to it, or it might have a possessive already. So I found my determiners. I want to find the head words. Well, let me look here. The lush cinematic rainforest. Lush and cinematic could not be possessive. I couldn't say his lush. I couldn't say her cinematic. I couldn't, rain is a little bit different. Basically, the head word here is forest. Rain is modifying forest. Yes, rain is technically a noun, and we'll get to how a noun can be an adjective, but our head word right here is forest of this noun phrase, the lush cinematic rainforest. Now, I've already pointed out the possessives here, James Cameron's and Avatar. That would make Avatar our head word, because that is what is the noun that is being kind of possessed in this phrase. And then we're skipping a lot of words. These are not nouns. We found this determiner, the teeming orc armies of Peter Jackson's Hobbit series. Now, you might be inclined to say, all of this from the until series is a single noun phrase, but actually we've got a couple of noun phrases here. The teeming orc armies, the is actually referring to this head word, armies right here. Teeming and orc are modifying armies. And then this preposition is starting a new noun phrase. And so the second noun phrase is Peter Jackson's Hobbit series. And the head word here is series, because it's not Hobbit, because Hobbit is modifying which series? Which series are we talking about? Is it the Hobbit series, the Lord of the Rings series, and so forth? Whereas here, Avatar is the final key noun of that noun phrase. Now, you might think we've gotten them all, but actually we've missed a really key one, and that is, oops, wrong button, CGI. CGI is a noun. It is, if you want to call it a noun phrase, sure. How do we know that it's a noun, even if it doesn't have a determiner? We just ask, could we put one? The CGI, his CGI. That works. That suggests that this is not only a noun, but because it's all by itself, it must be its own sort of noun phrase. If you want to call a single word a noun phrase, I mean, it's fine, whatever makes it easier. But normally we think of a bunch of words as a phrase. But anyways, those are my determiners and those are my nouns. So let me jump to number 4. In the operating room, surgeons may rely on three-dimensional images to improve their patients' prognoses. Well, we got our determiner, the, and I think that's the only determiner that we have, which means what comes after would be, or it must be part of a noun phrase, the operating room, and room would be the head word. Now, remember that the head word is not always the last word in the noun phrase. You can have modifiers after your head word, but for now, it's the last one. Surgeons may rely on three-dimensional images. Now, I know surgeons here is a noun because that could have a determiner or possessive, or it could be plural. It is plural. So that would be a noun. These surgeons, we could say. So that's its own head word and noun phrase. Three-dimensional images. Images is another one. We have it plural. Three-dimensional is modifying which type of images. Notice that there's also a preposition, but we'll get to prepositional phrases later. And then finally, we have this possessive pronoun there. We have this modifier and this final head word, prognoses. So the is our determiner. That's the only determiner we have. The other head words we have are room, surgeons, images, and prognoses. Let's look at the last one. Let me erase all my marks on my screen. Let's look at number 6. Clearly, this innovation has the potential to shape our future. Clearly can't be made possessive. That's actually an adverb. We'll talk about that soon, so we can throw that one aside. This is a pronoun modifier, so we know that that's part of a noun phrase. And the head word is, in fact, innovation. So this is the noun phrase, this innovation, and innovation is the head word. Here's our determiner, the potential. That would make potential our head word of this noun phrase, the potential. To shape our future. Our is possessive. Future is the head word of that because that is the noun of that noun phrase. You could not, for instance, say his, our. So you know that in the noun phrase, our is not the head word. You have to make sure to find the noun when you're looking for the head word. And there might be other nouns, as we pointed out, but kind of the primary noun that everything else is modifying. So those would be the determiners and head words for these exercises, okay? And then you can, of course, do 1, 3, and 5 on your own and check your answers on the book. All right, now one of the most important steps towards grasping English grammar is to recognize that not only are there nouns and noun phrases like we just went over, but there are also nominals. And what I mean by that is a bunch of words that functions as a noun phrase, though it doesn't really look like one. Now what I mean by function will make more sense after the next lecture, but let me just give you an example. In the sentence, for dinner, I will eat blank, I could fill that blank in with a noun like chicken. I will eat chicken, or a noun phrase like I will eat her fried chicken. Or I could fill it in with a nominal clause like whatever I had for dinner last night. I will eat whatever I had for dinner last night. Now, that clause or phrase, whatever you want to call it for now, whatever I had for dinner last night, that might not seem like a noun-like thing. It seems like we have some nouns in there, but how is that all a noun? And my point is that it is functioning like a noun. It is fulfilling the role of a noun in this sentence. It is the thing that I am eating, whatever I had, or I will eat, whatever I had for dinner last night. That will make more sense as we go along, but for now I just want you to know, to understand that when we're talking about nouns and nouns phrases, we can also refer to nominals, things that don't necessarily look like nouns or nouns phrases, but actually still perform the function of a noun or noun phrase. All right, so we've talked a lot about words. Let's put it together into sentences. So a sentence is just a bunch of words based on an independent clause. It often starts with a capital letter. It ends with a terminal punctuation like a period or question mark or exclamation point. Now we'll talk more about what makes a clause dependent and independent later in the semester. But basically for now, it's just something that can stand on its own, an independent clause. A sentence must have exactly 2 parts. A subject, which can be a noun or noun phrase or nominal, and the predicate, which is a verb or verb phrase. And they almost always go in that order. You go subject first and then predicate. There are some exceptions. We will talk about those. But for now, just think first subject and then verb, right? We don't say Jill, we don't say ran Jill, we say Jill ran. Ran Jill would just make us confused. So think subject and then predicate. Now, this might seem pretty simple, but believe me when I say that being able to identify the subject and predicate of a sentence is perhaps the fundamental skill for learning English grammar. Once you learn to identify the subject and verb of a sentence, almost everything else will be much, much simpler. So we want to make sure that we grasp this concept very clearly. Let's look at a few examples. The subject of these sentences are bolded and the predicates are in italics. Subjects can be simple noun phrases like those students or the book that my grandmother gave me, or they can be a nominal like being a gangster. Remember that a predicate is a verb phrase and all its components are modifiers, some of which might be nouns or nominals. We'll talk about that. It is basically everything that comes after the subject. If you think in terms of subject comes first and then the predicate, then once you've identified the subject, basically everything else is the predicate. It should be pretty straightforward to find. So the predicates here are love to run by the road, has been resting on the shelf for 2 years, and ain't easy. All right, so you might be wondering, well, okay, then how do I find the subject if that's the first and key step? Now, I will admit it can be pretty tricky at first, especially when you're starting to analyze sentences at first. So I'm going to give you 3 key tips that will help you find the subject of any sentence. First, the subject will not be found in an introductory phrase or anything that comes before an opening comma. Even if that introductory phrase looks like it has a subject, you might think that in the example that I is the subject of the sentence, but it is actually these chores. That is because when I return is dependent, which, as I said, we'll talk about later. Technically, when I return is what we call a dependent clause. So yes, I is the subject of that dependent clause, but it is not the subject of our sentence, because for the subject of our sentence, we have to focus on the independent clause. So when you're trying to identify the subject of a sentence, throw away all dependent clauses, which are often found in introductory phrases. That's why we can set aside introductory phrases. Okay, the next tip. Know that the subject will never be in a prepositional phrase. Prepositions are words like in, of, around, or by, and they always include a noun or noun phrase or some type of nominal, but those will never ever be the subject. So once you find a preposition and its phrase, you can just cancel that out. Finally, the best trick for finding the subject is to try and see how much of a sentence you can replace with a pronoun like it or she or they. This will make sure you find not only the noun head word, but all of its modifiers. Because remember, the subject comes before the predicate. So if, after you have tried to find the subject by replacing a word or phrase with a pronoun, and you still have some words left over that come in front of the pronoun, then your subject is probably bigger than you realize, and you actually need to replace even more words with that pronoun to make sure that you fully grasp what the subject is. All right, let's look at a few examples. First off, despite two-a-day practices, those students love to run by the road. Now, I know the subject can't be anywhere in despite two-a-day practices because that's an introductory phrase, so I can throw that away. And I also know that it can't be the road because that's part of a prepositional phrase, by the road. And I know that the subject can't just be students because that would leave those before it. And the subject is everything that comes before the predicate. And if I just said those, they, it sounds pretty goofy, right? But I can replace those students with the pronoun they, and I can see, I can see that the verb phrase love to run comes after it. So I know those students is my subject. Let's try another example. Okay, this one doesn't have an introductory phrase, so we can skip that. On the shelf and for 2 years are both prepositional phrases, so those are out. Now, this is where people might get tripped up. You might think, well, is it book or grandmother or me? And you might be tempted to choose grandmother or me if you've learned previously that the subject is the main part or actor of the sentence. But main part or actor are not reliable guides at all. In fact, they will probably lead you astray more often than not. So let's instead try our pronoun trick. Now, I can replace grandmother with she, but that still leaves me with way too much left over to be the subject, both before and after. And if I replace book with it, I notice that it is ungrammatical. That means that the subject is more than just book. Instead, the subject is the book that my grandmother gave me, the head word book, and all its determiners and modifiers, all of which can be replaced with the pronoun it. Everything that comes after that, that right there is my predicate. Has been resting. Okay, last example. Being a gangster ain't easy. No introductory phrases, no prepositional phrases, so we're good there. Now, you will probably think that gangster is the subject here, especially because if I replace gangster with it makes grammatical sense. Being it ain't easy. But notice that when you do that, you have being left over. And so you might think, well, being, that sounds like a verb. That's probably the predicate. But no, remember that in English, we go subject and then predicate. And you can't have predicate, then subject, then predicate again. So the entire phrase, being a gangster, is in fact our subject. We can replace all of that with it, and our predicate is ain't easy to make the sentence, it ain't easy, right? That suggests to us that being a gangster as a whole is in fact our subject. All right, so let's look at a few of the exercises. You will do the odd numbers on your own, so we will look at the even numbers. The instructions say find the border between the subject and the predicate of the sentences from the previous discussion, then supply a pronoun for the subject. So if we look at number 2, the mayor's husband spoke against the ordinance. I don't have any introductory phrases. My prepositional phrase is against the ordinance, so I can throw that out. Plus it's at the very end of the sentence. We know we go subject and predicate. Now I know I have a a noun phrase here, the mayor's husband. And I know that husband, let me get my, noun is my, the is my determiner. Husband is my head word because mayor's is a possessive, modifying husband. And then comes the verb spoke, which has been tense. And we remember that verbs can be tense. So I know that this is my verb phrase, or excuse me, this is my noun phrase. And it's coming before the predicate. And it can also replace with he. He spoke against the ordinance. So that's my subject right there. The mayor's husband, that whole phrase. Number 4, the merchants in town are unhappy. All right. Now, in town is a prepositional phrase. I know that town then is not my subject, but that does mean that in town could be part of my subject. So I don't want you to think that prepositional phrases can't be part of the subject. They just can't contain the subject. The is a determiner, so we know we have a noun phrase here. The noun phrase we have are the merchants in town. I have a tense verb here, are unhappy is the full verb phrase. So this would be my subject noun phrase, the merchants in town, and I can replace that with they are unhappy, okay? All right, I think this video has gone long enough. I'm going to break here, and then I'll continue talking about adverbs and adverbials, and we will pick it up there.